2 Corinthians 12:2, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body, I cannot tell, or whether out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such an one called up to the, watch how it's described, third heaven. So, third heaven, when we see this verse, that would tell us that there isn't a singular heaven. There's a plurality of heavens. Does that make sense? And so this man is called up into the third heaven. The third heaven is God's dwelling place. To be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, and so we would be able to be with the Lord, dwelling in His eternal place when we die. Now go to Luke 11, and we'll just solidify understanding that God's dwelling place, the third heaven, is the place where He resides. Luke chapter 11, look at verse number 2. And the disciples are being taught how to pray, and we see that it says in verse 2, and He said unto them, Jesus is saying this, when ye pray, say, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So God, our Father, which art in heaven, what heaven is this referring to? That's His dwelling place, the third heaven. There are three that bear record in heaven. Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. These three are one. What is that? What is that verse referencing? God's eternal dwelling place, the third heaven, 2 Corinthians 12, identifies it as. Now, God, we remember we talked about this last week, matter isn't eternal. God is eternal. And God, because He is eternal, His dwelling place, the third heaven, that is an eternal place. Does that make sense? Where God dwells, it's an eternal residence and an eternal place. And I want to look at a few more verses before we move past this. Go back in your Old Testament to the book of Nehemiah. It's before Psalms, Proverbs, it's before Job. Flip backwards from Job, you'll go past Esther, and then you'll come to the book of Nehemiah. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then Job. And we're going to land in Nehemiah 6. Nehemiah 9, I'm sorry, verse 6. Nehemiah 9, verse 6. Bible says, Thou, even Thou, art Lord alone. Thou hast made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth, and all the things that are therein, the seas, and all that is in therein. Now preservest them all, and the host of heaven worshipeth Thee. So there's a plurality of heavens, and Nehemiah 9:6 gives us that. God's made the heaven, and He's made the heaven of heavens. And we're going to see what all this means as we go through these lessons. So there's multiple heavens. Go to Psalms 68. Psalms 68. Verse 33. Psalm 68, verse 33. Bible says, Psalm 68:33, Bible says, To Him that rideth upon the heavens of heavens, which were of old, lo, He doth send out His voice, and that a mighty voice. On top of all the heavens is the heaven of heavens, the third heaven. That's where God rides. Okay? There's multiple heavens. And the last one we'll look at to just solidify the multiple heavens, and that there's three of them, is Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy 10, rather. Deuteronomy 10, look at verse 14. Deuteronomy 10, verse 14. The Bible says, Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens, that's multiple heavens, is the Lord's thy God, the earth also, with all that therein is. So we got that, we understand that. Multiple heavens. God's eternal dwelling place is the third heaven. We got it? Got it? Okay. That's the introduction. Now let's start to get into the meat of the message. Go to Genesis 1. Genesis 1. In Genesis chapter number 1, the Bible says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Heaven singular. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Now this heaven in Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1, it couldn't be referring to God's dwelling place, because God is eternal, and His eternal dwelling place, He's there. Okay? So this has to be referring to a heaven that would be lower or beneath or not as sovereign as God's dwelling place. And so it says here that He created it. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So this is interesting as we move into the second verse, because now it jumps right to, and it says this, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, we're not going to tackle everything in verse 2, but I want to just ask you this. Some key words, there's a lot of them in this verse, but the key words I'd like to point out this afternoon is this. Look at void. Look at darkness. Look at without form. Is God the author of confusion? He's not. Would God create something that wasn't done decently in order or in order? Would God create something that is confusing or without form or without void? I don't think He would. And this is going to play out to be interesting in your mind in some of these Bible verses we're going to look at. It seems like Genesis 1:1, it starts off with order. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's order. There's no darkness. It's ordered. God created it. It's good. But now we see, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. When I read my Bible from cover to cover, it seems to me that darkness always is the consequence of sin. So the question I'd like to tackle this over the series of these messages that we'll be doing is, did something happen between verse 1 and verse 2? And if it did, what? What happened? If something happened, what is it? There's a void, and the earth was without form and void. Well, God doesn't create a void. But the earth we see is without form. It's darkness. The Bible says God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all, right? So if in God there's no darkness at all, we have in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, well, He doesn't create in darkness. In Him, there is no darkness in Him. It seems to me that there's something there. Look at 2 Corinthians 4 and hold your spot in Genesis 1, but go to 2 Corinthians 4. 2 Corinthians 4, look at verse 6. The Bible says in 2 Corinthians 4:6, for God, who commanded the light to shine in darkness or out of darkness? Out. The light to shine out of darkness hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. You see, God is the one who brings light or goodness into our dark hearts. Our hearts are darkened, our hearts are evil, and now we get God doesn't save us in darkness. God saves us out of darkness, and He places you in Him where there is no darkness at all, because in Him is light. So He saves us out of a dark, sin-cursed, hell-bound life, and He places us in Jesus Christ. So that's the idea there for our salvation. I think we understand that. But concerning Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, also consider this verse. Go to Isaiah 45. Go to Isaiah 45. And let's see if this helps tie some verses together. Isaiah 45, look at verse 18. The Bible says in Isaiah 45:18, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens," plural. Well, this can't be the third heaven, His eternal dwelling place. It always has been. 2 Corinthians 12 told us that there's three heavens. The third one's God's dwelling place. So there must be two other heavens below that third heaven. Well, God says this, "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens." He says, "God Himself that formed the earth and made it, He hath established it, He created it not in vain." He formed it. It wasn't without form. It says He formed it to be inhabited. Well, something that is non-inhabitable is void and without form, and it's dark. Isaiah 45:18 tells us that God doesn't create in vain. He says He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is none else. So I believe that Genesis 1:1, God created something to be inhabited, not desolate. God creates good, not bad. And I'm convinced, and we're going to run a lot of verses over the next couple of weeks, that in Genesis 1:2, something happened where the earth was put into a form of void, darkness, and it was void and it was without form. I think something happened there. Go back to Genesis 1. Let's see. Let's continue on our thought on considering these different heavens. Look at verse number 6. Genesis 1, verse number 6. Well, let's do that. "And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Where did we first see the word water in the chapter? Verse number 2, right? It says, "And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Verse number 6, it says, God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." In Genesis chapter 1-2, was the earth completely submerged in water? And then God said, "I'm going to take that water and I'm going to divide it. And I'm going to create a vast expanse. I'm going to create a heaven. I'm going to create a firmament. I'm going to take that water, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the thing." Hold your spot in Genesis. Get Job 26. We'll come back to Genesis. But let's look at this in light of Job 26. In Job 26, let's look at verse 7. The Bible says, "He stretcheth out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing." If it's hung upon nothing, it's in emptiness. What is that emptiness? It's a vast expanse. It's a heaven. There's nothing there. It says, it's and hangeth the earth upon nothing. NASA and SpaceX have an unquenchable desire to try to discover if there are other life forms out in the firmament, out in the heaven. Well, God told you in Job 26, there ain't nothing out there. He hung it upon nothing. Around it, there's nothing. There is nothing out there. Well, we want to do interplanetary travel, and we want to get an AI-made man to live on Mars, and we want to be able to have travel interplanetary, and we want to learn how to survive on Mars. And people want to go to a place where God already told you there's nothing and nobody out there. You know what's under the third heaven, God's eternal dwelling place? The second heaven and the first heaven, and we'll get to how those were split in a minute. But let me ask you this. Why do people want to get out into the second heaven, outer space? Why? Because they don't want to go to the third heaven and get in contact with God. They want to get in contact with something or somebody that isn't out there. It's just anything but God. Anything but God. And we burn billions and billions and billions of dollars in the air where God told us there ain't nothing out there. It's a vast expanse. Well, He told us what's out there. The sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. But this idolatrous obsession with outer space is just a thumbing of the nose at God, because there's someone that dwells in the third heaven, and you can easily get in contact with Him. You can easily commune with Him. You can easily have a relationship with Him, and He'll sustain you. But no, we want to learn how to sustain ourselves on the moon. Come on, come on. In Him is life, and where they want to go, there is no life, for a reason. Because you got to go beyond the first heaven, you got to go beyond the second heaven, and you got to get into the dwelling place of God if you want to have life. Other than that, you just have nothing. Now keep your finger in Job and go back to Genesis 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse number 3. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Keep your finger in Genesis 1 and go back to Job. And this time, get Job 38. Think of this as light. Okay, you got light. Okay. Now, God, what He said in verse 3-5, He said, what's He going to do? He's going to divide the light. And watch what it says in Job 38. Job 38, verse 24, it says, by what way is the light parted? See that? God can part light. He can divide light. Which scattereth the east wind upon the earth. God is the one who controls everything in this universe, who has created everything in this universe. And if He says He can divide light, he can do it. And He has done it in Genesis chapter 1. It's confirmed in Job 38. Keep your finger in Job 38. But we have to slip back to Genesis 1 again. But keep your finger in Job 38. Read this again. God said, verse number 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. That's a vast expanse. That's a space. And let it divide the waters from the waters. So that water God takes, He divides it, and now there's something in between that firmament. And He makes this firmament and says, God made the firmament, And he divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so, and God called the firmament heaven, capital H, not lowercase h, in verse number 1. So in the beginning God created the heaven. There was, at that point, there was God's dwelling place, the eternal heaven. And in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. So there was an earth and there was two heavens. The eternal heaven of God, His dwelling place, and then everything under God's eternal dwelling place, down to the earth, was considered another heaven. So in Genesis 1:1, I really think at that point you had two heavens. But it says in the beginning God created the heaven because His dwelling place, He didn't create, it's always been eternal. So He has His dwelling place, everything under His dwelling place to the earth is all considered heaven. What He does when He creates this firmament is that what we'll get to this next week and the following Sunday. But in Genesis 1:2, if the earth is fully submerged in water and God takes that water and He creates a divide. And so now what you have is, right under God's dwelling place, now you have water. And then under that, what you have is what the scientists call outer space. The sun and the moon, the stars and all that. And then you have the clouds, another body of water, a firmament. God takes those waters, He splits it. He's got something right under His eternal dwelling place, space, clouds, and then under that, another vast expanse. And then we get down to the earth, and then what do we have? Water in the seas, right? So we have three bodies of water. One under God's dwelling place, one in the clouds, and then one on the earth, which is the ground. So God, when He creates that firmament, He makes a divide, He makes a split. And so now we have three heavens. The first heaven, we look up and we see where the birds fly, we see the clouds, all of that is considered the first heaven. The airplanes go and all that, first heaven. Above that, you get way above the clouds, now you enter into the second heaven. And you get beyond that second heaven, you're going to hit another body of water, which we're going to talk about in the next coming lessons. You're going to get into God's eternal dwelling place, which no man can go unless he's been placed in the body, and we're going to get into all that. But for the sake of this afternoon, let's understand God's eternal dwelling place is the third heaven. It's always existed. In Genesis chapter 1, verse number 1, in the beginning God created the heaven. Under His eternal dwelling place was one vast expanse. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, the face of the waters rather. If the earth is fully submerged in water, God splits that water, creates two firmaments, and so now we have two different heavens. And so the reason it's capitalized in verse 8 is because God created a new place. A new place. You had a first heaven and a second heaven. By the way, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. That's a lot, but we got to go a little bit more in Job 38. Job 38. And over the next 6 weeks, all this will start to piece together fully, but let's read verse 38. Look at verse 8. Okay, hold on. Let's look at verse 7. Job 38:7. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. If you weren't here when we did the lessons on the angels, or if you don't already know, this verse is referring to the sons of God. There's angels that are shouting for joy when God created the heaven and the earth. Well, they're not listed in Genesis 1, verses 3 all the way down to 11, or down to 30 or 31. You don't see in any of that creation account, that 6-day creation account, you don't see angels being created, right? So where do you place these sons of God? In Job 38, verse number 7, where do you place these sons of God who are shouting for joy? you got to place them at Genesis 1:1. I don't know anywhere else to place them. Why would they shout for joy at verse 2? Man, this is dark, this is void, this is without form. Yeah, shout. I don't think they would be shouting for joy at verse 2. I think something happened between verse 1 and verse 2, and they certainly were there shouting for joy at verse number 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. But let's keep reading in Job 38. Look at verse 8. Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. And here shall thy proud waves be stayed. God's talking about water. In Genesis 1:2, His Spirit moves upon the face of the waters. And Job 38 tells us God has control of those waters. He can move them and control them and stop them wherever He plans or wherever He sees fit. So when God creates that firmament, you know what He says? I'm going to divide the waters. And you, water, you're going to be up here and you're going to be stayed. It's as if I took a baby and put a swaddling band around that baby, and that baby's going to stay in there. God says, I'm dividing the water, and you're going to stay there, and you're not going anywhere else. And I'm going to put some water here, and you're not going to go anywhere else. And I'm going to put some water down here, and you're not going to go anywhere else. God is the one who can do that. He controls all of it. He decreed that the water would stay where God says it's going to stay. So what we see in Genesis 1 is God forming containers for where water would stay. And God did that. It wasn't evolutionary processes. Okay, we got to keep going on Job 38. Look at verse number 30. Job 38. Go all the way down to verse 25. Job 38:25. Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning of thunder? Well, where's that watercourse? It's not on the earth. It says, or a way for the lightning of thunder. Look at verse 26, to cause it to rain on the earth. So we've got water above to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness where there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth. Hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Out of the womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it? We're going to look at some ice next Sunday or the following. But verse 30 says, the waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep, we'll look at the face of the deep over the next couple of Sundays, the Bible says is frozen. So you have a face of the deep that's frozen. And now look at verse number 34. The Bible says, canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of water may cover thee? Well, so we have some clouds. Verse 34. Clouds are water things, right? And then we have in verse number 30, we have the face of the deep, and we have something frozen. Look what's in between verse 30 and verse 34. I'll read the verses, and then you tell me what's in between verse 30 and 34. Watch. Canst thou bind the sweet influence of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? What do you have between the face of the deep that's frozen in verse 30 and then the clouds in verse 34? You got You got space. You got stars. Where is that? That's the second heaven. How do you get there? From the earth, you go past the first heaven, you hit the clouds, you go past the clouds, and you see all that stuff from 31 to 33. Orion and those stars, all that. That's where the astrologers want to find God. And then you keep going, and then apparently there's something frozen. What's all that about? We won't get into it this afternoon, but we are going to get into understanding these frozen passages and these face of the deep passages. But what I want us to see is that God has divided light, God has divided waters, and God has created two heavens out of one original heaven. And that's what we see happens. Genesis 1:1, one heaven. Genesis 1:8, we see a capital H heaven. It's a place God created when He took waters and He divided them. And so now we have two out of one heaven. This is cool. Isaiah 40. Go forward to Isaiah 40. Isaiah 40, look at verse 12. Is this too deep for a Sunday afternoon? I hope we're getting some of that. All right, verse 40, chapter 40, verse number 12. This is how powerful God is. Anybody have a measuring stick on them, or like some type of, like a tape measure? Some of you, I got it in your car, right? Or some of you, keep it in your purse in case you go to Lowe's and you want to spend a bunch of money on landscaping. You can measure everything out there and get it all bought in one place. But a lot of us guys, we'll have it in our truck somewhere, glove box or something, right? And we're going to measure stuff out. Look what it says here in verse 12. Isaiah 40, verse 12. Who hath measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? God. Remember that verse in John, no man can pluck him out of my hand, I give him life. You can start walking right now, you'll never walk out. He measured the waters in the hollow of his hand. Nobody's taking you out of God. And if you wanted to get out of God, you wouldn't have enough time until you died to walk out. He measured the waters that way. Folks, that's our God. Try reading that in an evolutionist class, science class. All right, we're not done, but we're heading that way. I need you to get Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and Genesis 1. Psalms, Proverbs, you come to the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and get Genesis 1. We understand now how we started off in Genesis 1:1 with just two heavens. The one was not created, it's the eternal heaven where God dwelt. The reason heaven is singular in Genesis 1:1 is because besides the everlasting eternal heaven where God dwells, what He created was a firmament or a vast expanse from where His dwelling place is down to the earth, and He called that one heaven. And then we understand verses 6 through 9 that God took the waters, He divided them, and He created two heavens out of the one that's listed in Genesis 1. And the reason it's capitalized in verse 8 is to show that He created a new place. So Genesis 1, look at verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth. It's capital E. Because remember, matter isn't eternal. God is the one who is eternal. So what we have is a void, formless, dark place that's been created. God created it in good, but I believe something happened there. And so now what God is doing is He's remaking it. And so He takes something that's void and He makes it into this place now, and He calls it earth. He forms it into this dry land called earth, which by the way, He doesn't call the water earth, He calls the dry land earth. And that's important because when we look at the entire earth, it consists of bodies of water as well as land. And we typically say, well, that's the earth. No, God really calls the dry land itself the earth. So, and then it says, in the gathering together of the waters called He seas, and God saw that it was good. Well, praise the Lord, it is good. Look at verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, and the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser night to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the earth... Well, let me stop here. Because God is not in the first heaven or the second heaven, He's in the third heaven, His eternal dwelling place. In Him is light. And because He's not dwelling in the second heaven, it's nothing, it's void. What does He have to do? He has to put light there. And so that's where we're getting now how we're going to keep track of time. By the sun and the moon, right? And that's how people told time, specifically Jewishly by the moon. But anyway, we know how to keep time now. And now we see in verse number 20, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Where do the fowl fly? From, under the clouds, but above the earth, right? What is that called? The open firmament of heaven. That's the first heaven there. From clouds down to the earth, first heaven. Birds are up there, you see, first heaven. But what came out of the water? Life. The waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life. It produced life. Life. Water. Water is all around us. We are breathing in water. We have a wood stove, and we put on the wood stove, which my wife's not happy about this, but I just don't have a better solution. She does, but I'm just stubborn. But it's just, we burn this wood, it takes all the humidity out of the house. So you get real dry. So I take a pot and I put it on there, and I put water in the pot, and you wake up in the morning and water is gone. Where is it? It's in the air. We're breathing it in. Because we need water. Of course, it gets onto the wood stove and it rusts, and you got to clean all that out. But the point is this. When you go out, you can go to the desert, and you're going to get 1% humidity, 0.5% humidity. You get into a foggy place where it's all fog, you're in a place that's got 100% humidity. What are you breathing in? We are surrounded by water. We can't get away from it. We need water to live. You can't live more than 3 days without water. Water pictures life. Ecclesiastes 1. Look at verse 7. Science class, kids. Aiden, this is science. It says in verse 7, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. An itsy-bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. What comes up? The sun? Up comes the sun and died upon the rain, and the itsy-bitsy spider went up the water spout. You know the nursery rhyme? You know what that is? That's this verse. You know what that is? You got clouds. They bring down rain. The rain gets into the river, it gets into the lakes, it gets into the ocean, and what's it do? The clouds take it back up again, it comes up, and then that cycle repeats itself. Now, the evolutionists call it, well, circle of life and all that kind of stuff that you get out of the, the Disney stuff and the Dolly Parton stuff and everything down there. All of that is, they don't know what they're talking about, but they know something's there. God calls this His cycle. He controls how that water works. He's the one. That water cycle, precipitation, evaporation, condensation, transpiration, what's that? The water coming out of the plant leaves. It comes up, clouds get it, comes down, and just God is the one who handles all that. So look, we have something that's void and without form in Genesis 1 until something happens. The Spirit of God moves upon the face of what? Water. When the Spirit of God moves upon water, now life starts to happen because the Spirit of God's moving. Genesis 1:20, we read that life from water, living is coming out of water. Life is coming out of water. You know what you know where the earth came out of? Water. You know where you came out of? Adam. You know where Adam came out of? The earth. The earth comes out of water, life. Adam comes out of the earth, life. We come out of Adam, life. It's a water cycle. That earth that was fully submerged, God brought life to it from water. Our blood is very similar to seawater in many ways. Now, Will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but both are essential for life. Our blood and seawater both contain salt and water. Both maintain stable pH levels, although they are different pH levels. Both our blood and seawater maintain stable pH levels. Although they are different concentrations, both contain sodium and chloride ions. Both contain magnesium and copper and zinc, which are important for keeping things alive. Both serve as transport mediums. Blood transports nutrients, oxygen, and waste through the body. Seawater transports nutrients and dissolved gases through marine ecosystems. They function much the same way. You know what hospitals use for intravenous when they hook them up to the fluids? A medical saline solution. Although much less concentrated than seawater, they need to give them that medical saline solution because of the similarities. I wonder why. Could it be because of Genesis 1:20? All the water comes from God. God is the point of origin for life, and we don't have life outside of water. An earth submerged in water, God brings life out of it. That earth, God brings Adam out of it and gives him life, and we are all descendants of Adam. And you run that circle, as Ecclesiastes 1:7, all that water coming around, that's God. You get off that circle, the origin of that is God. He controls it, can measure it, and He provides it. He created it.